flawless experts who have all the answers. That's not this podcast. Instead, we chat with professionals who love what they do, have wisdom to share, and can laugh at their own mistakes. I'm Mark, and I'm the host of the WorkPlay Solutions podcast. So let's laugh, learn, and discover the joy of work. Boo, boo, boo. All right, Jim, how you doing today?
Morning, Mark. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. It's good to see you. I am very excited about today. We are here with Dr. Jim Cain, experiential learning legend. I'm going to use that word because he is. Facilitator, author of 28 different team building and group dynamic books and activity books and all those things. I'll let him introduce himself here in a minute. Let's just say I am super excited about hanging out with Jim this morning. Jim, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, I'll be glad to, Mark. Mark and I first met at a event that was held by my co-author for the book Teamwork and Team Play, Barry Jollif in Worcester, Ohio. And Mark came up for, I think it was called Teambuilding in the Barn. And we spent 3 days with facilitators, just getting to know each other. And also remember a particularly fun afternoon in Amish country, traveling around and going to some of our favorite places in that part of the world. So my name is Jim Cain. I grew up in Northeast Ohio. I now live in Western New York, near Rochester, where it is kind of a chilly, wintry morning day here. I grew up as a 4-H camp counselor. And because of that, I had lots of experience working with groups, even before I think team building became really popular. We used to call it group dynamics when I was in my youth. And because of that, over the years, it kind of became my passion. So in addition to my other work, I was an engineer at Eastman Kodak, and I worked in the technical field for quite a bit. Then I had the opportunity to try and kind of reinvent myself and do something new when film sales at Kodak went down. And as a result, I've had just a wonderful opportunity to work with people around the world doing their version of group dynamics and community building and team building and all those kind of good things. And over the years, I've written a few books, and that's what today's session is about.
Beautiful. I could not have said that better myself, which is why you're here. Yeah, so we'll be talking about Jim's newest book, Extraordinary Facilitation, Insights from Half a Century of Working and Playing with Groups, and carry that conversation into the other 27 books that Jim has written. Before we jump into that, some reminders. We're just glad to be back podcasting after our break. So thank you for joining us on this season. So normally, Jim, we start off with an icebreaker or warm up or energizer question. Actually, do you have a preferred term for those? I'm still trying to find a word that's better than energize or better than icebreaker.
I think when you work with audiences, and if you come out and you say a phrase like, let's do some icebreakers, no matter how enthusiastic you are, you can almost hear the collective groan from the audience. So I tend not to use words like team building or icebreakers. I just call it training, and we launch into it. In the post-pandemic world, a lot of people seem to be giving some latitude to words like rebuild, reconnect, re-engage. And that seems to be what's happening. But I would just call it opening activities. And here we go. Did you have one in mind?
Yeah, well, I was curious. So normally I'm providing this, but I'm going to put you on the spot here. Can we do one from one of your 7,000 books? So what's a favorite of yours that we can do with the two of us right now?
I like painless icebreakers, the kind of things that people can participate in that don't cause them to kind of shrink, behind the scene, but to really get them engaged with somebody. I also like to start off not in large groups, but just with partners. So people only have to talk to one person, not a group of 15, or, kind of expose themselves that way. Probably of the icebreakers in my repertoire, the one I like the most is an activity I call the big question. I give people cards that have questions on them. I would ask you a question, you would answer it. You would ask me one, I would answer it. Then we would switch cards and go find a new partner. And I just find that whole process painless for people. It's easy to talk about. They have their choice of several questions. Good things happen. I'll start off with the one this morning in that line, Mark, and we'll ask you this one here.
All right.
Of all the Christmas presents you've ever received, which one is most memorable?
When I was a kid, I wanted a radio-controlled car more than anything, and there was this one called the Trax or something like that, where it was like this tank. Instead of having regular wheels, it had tracks and it could flip over. Like it was an all-terrain kind of RC car, and it was just the coolest thing ever as a kid. I burnt out the engine. We had to get like send it in for service, and it was so much fun. I don't even remember exactly what it was called, but it was this RC car with, tank like tracks that I would just drive over everything I could find.
Nice. Well, your turn. You can ask me one now.
I like to ask the same ones. What was a favorite Christmas present that you had, or memorable Christmas present?
The one that comes to mind was we had these, I guess you would call them slot racers. There's like a racetrack that had 2 lanes on it, and it made a figure 8 configuration. And you had these kind of hand, I guess we call those joysticks in those days, but it was kind of a hand controller for the speed. And I just remember, and you should know this, I still have it. It's in a box in my basement, but that original kind of racetrack racer that I had, that was fun. And my dad had set it up and we would play together. And I remember that being kind of a unique point. It was at an age where I remember some of the cool things that came my way, and still believed in Santa and things like that. So it was a memorable Christmas. And my the thing I remember most about that racetrack, other than being set up underneath the Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, which always amazes me that parents have time to do that, is our family had this curse of what I'd call Christmas trees. We never really got a tree-like looking thing. It was always kind of a bush. And there was actually these 2 screw eyes in the base panel of our home where we would fasten this thing to, so it wouldn't fall over, like during the holidays and stuff like that. And it took up a whole corner of our living room, and it didn't really have a top. It just kind of stopped where the ceiling was. So it was just this evergreen. I mean, the place smelled great, but it was far from looking like a traditional Christmas tree.
That's awesome. That reminds me of when I was a kid. My dad had a side hustle of selling, shrubs and Christmas trees just in a small like Christmas tree garden we had. So when it was time to get a Christmas tree, we would literally just go out back and cut one down and bring it into the house. So it was like, well, it's right there. So
well, see, here's the value of Mark's podcast here. You get not only the information you signed in for today, but these great retrospectives of the life and times of the people who are talking on the air here today.
I'm tempted to go down the tangent of real tree versus fakes, but I'll resist. So just you can answer that question in your mind. Let's talk a little bit about the start of your career, and you mentioned this briefly. You were an engineer at Kodak, or was it Eastman Kodak at that time, or Kodak?
Yeah, here in Rochester, yes.
Okay. How did you get from there to the world of facilitation and leading groups?
I think in a lot of ways, I did that first. During my high school years, when I was 13 years old, my county extension agent, my 4-H agent, called my mom and said, "We don't have enough male counselors for our junior camp, 7, 8, 9-year-olds. Would your son be interested?" And my mom was so surprised. She said, "You would take him for a whole week? Take him." So the next thing I know, I'm off going to camp. And I had a very positive experience. And then later in my teen years, I was a lifeguard. I could call square dances, and I was a boomerang thrower. So I had these 3 skills that camp people really kind of liked. They always needed lifeguards, and I had some extra skills. So I kind of got involved with summer camps, and this would be mid to late 70s. And during that time, it was just the beginning of things like ropes courses and things like that. So team challenge and adventure-based learning was just in its infancy, I think, in terms of my experience in Central Ohio. But over the years, it became this kind of passion. I had my work. I had the things I enjoyed in engineering. But then on the side, friends would say, "Hey, we're running camp this week. Would you come and help us? Or could you stop by for a day or 2 during our staff training?" So I began playing in this thing called group dynamics and team building in the late 70s. And even during my engineering years, it came out. I'll give you a quick example. At Kodak, we were having a release party for a new product, and we were having a picnic in the park. And one of the supervisors said, "Hey, Jim, I heard you were a camp counselor. Could you come up with some wacky Olympics for us to play with all the people?" And I designed a thing that you got bonus points if you had a cross-functional team, somebody from marketing, somebody from sales, somebody from engineering, somebody from manufacturing. And it had a very positive experience on the company. And they allowed me, even while I was an engineer, to attend 4 or 5 kind of challenge course and adventure-based learning workshops that year.
Hmm.
So I could bring more of that back to them. So they saw the value in groups working together. We had a fairly, I think, creative workspace,
Hmm.
but it wasn't necessarily team oriented.
Mhm.
And because of my work, I got to actually bring some of that to Kodak. And then when film sales dropped and other things happened in the Kodak world, and I had a chance to try a new career, I kind of gravitated towards team building. And my first book, Teamwork and Team Play, that I wrote with Barry Jollif, kind of became a landmark book, if you will. There wasn't anything like it, and a lot of colleges picked it up as a textbook. So I was just grateful that I had kind of a lucky start, if you will, to the
Mhm.
profession.
Well, Teamwork and Team Play is still one of my all-time favorite team building activity books and theory books. So thank you.
I should share with you, I'm getting ready to do a conference coming up for Christian summer camps here in the United States. And one of the people in the early days said, there's 2 books on my nightstand, the Holy Bible and Teamwork and Team Play. I thought, well, that's pretty good company, you know.
Then saith Jim.
You know, Mark, honestly, I felt grateful and lucky, and maybe it was the right voice at the right time. I did something in that book that other people hadn't done. I knew a lot of team building props, but there were no commercial suppliers for them. So I showed people how to build them in that first book, because otherwise they weren't gonna be able to find these things on the commercial market at that time. There wasn't anybody who was, selling these things as props. So maybe I hit, kind of just a sweet spot in the adventure-based learning world at the time. And I will always be grateful for that wonderful start to my career.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about Extraordinary Facilitation, the newest book. Before I hear kind of what your definition of facilitation and what makes it extraordinary, I'm going to remind our listeners that in episode 5, Rhonda and I did a chat about what do facilitators do, and our working definition, which we are always willing to improve upon, was that facilitation is the art and science of skillfully using the techniques and principles of experiential learning to help a group of people reach their goals. And a facilitator is a neutral person that uses facilitation to help a group of people meet their goals. So that was our working definition in episode 5. Feel free to go back and check that out. But I'm curious, Jim, how do you define facilitation, and what does extraordinary facilitation mean?
It's a big question, and I think here's the value in that question, Mark. We live in a profession, the adventure-based learning and experiential learning world, where so many different people can come from their particular theme and be part of that community. So you could have corporate trainers as part of this. You can have therapeutic recreation specialists. You can have camp counselors. You can have people who work on ropes courses and people who do, ecotourism and things like that. So there's lots of different people who show up in the adventure base and the facilitation world that come from entirely different backgrounds. And I think that makes us stronger as a profession, because once I kind of decided I knew pretty well the things that were happening at summer camps, then I found out, there were colleges doing this, and there were people, teaching these same principles from entirely other walks of life. And I just think that makes us stronger as a profession, because it has a real breadth to it. I think your definition is valid. How it played out for me when I wrote Extraordinary Facilitation was, there's a certain age in your life when you feel like you can write a synopsis, if you will, or kind of a retrospective of your work. And I couldn't quite decide, but I figured after 50 years of working with groups, that was probably a decent milestone. At least I had street credibility for making that happen. So my idea was, I wanted to take a look back at this world that I've been so grateful to be a part of, and just talk about some of the things that I think helped me become a professional in terms of my facilitation skills, in terms of my knowledge. I like PBS's model, the Lifelong Learning Channel. And I have a unique kind of history here in Rochester, New York, where I live. I hold the record in my local library for taking the most books out in a single year. Now, there's a group home that has 80 residents, and they've taken out more total books. But as an individual, I've got that. And even throughout the pandemic and things like that, like right now, I think I have 34 books from my library that are sitting out there. And I'm kind of a voracious reader and always trying to come up with new things. When people say, how did you write a book like that? I have an easy answer. When they're sleeping, I'm reading. I try to keep growing and learning new skills. So the idea behind Extraordinary Facilitation was to write a book that would help people go from wherever they're at to being better at the skill of facilitation. And one of the first things I did in the book was, in the first chapter, I have what I call 100 tips and tools for being a better facilitator. But in addition to the commentary, I put homework assignments for each one of those. The fact is that Teamwork and Team Play, its second year in production, made it into 88 colleges as a textbook. And that was nice. And I thought it'd be great to have a book that met the needs of the academic community, so you could pass it out and use it as a reference book for your classes. But there would also be assignments in there to help people really improve their facilitation skills. And that's been a really fun process to work with, because like you, Mark, I'll bet a lot of your clients say things like, I'd like to do what you do, or I want to be, the kind of facilitator that you are. And giving them a roadmap or a path of how to get there is kind of an important thing. And I don't expect them to be a cookie cutter of me, but to be their own authentic facilitation self. But I thought if I could help them put together some ideas of how they could improve their facilitation skills. And I just listed these things, and that was a wonderful way to start. There's lots of other good stuff in the book, but I think that first chapter is something that's going to be influential and important to the facilitation community at large.
I'll go ahead and put out a plug for you right now. So if you want to level up your skills, buy this book. And just something that folks, I don't do a ton of promotion on the podcast, but I will say it's appropriate to this context. One of the workshops that WorkPlay offers is Bring Training to Life, how to make learning more fun, memorable, and effective. So that's a half-day workshop, kind of on that same theme that Jim had mentioned. If you want to use these skills but don't come from an experiential learning background, say you're a manager or a corporate trainer, where you are in a role where you are training and teaching other people, but what you learned was PowerPoint, we can help. So I love that. I'll see if I can get my wife to buy me that Extraordinary Facilitation for Christmas. So
I'll bring you a copy next time we play Frisbee golf in Atlanta.
Beautiful, beautiful. I don't expect you to do a full rehash of the book, but what are some of those lessons and takeaways and insights that you've had over the last 50 years?
Well, I'll give you a couple of quick examples that are easy to talk about, Mark, in the first chapter. In fact, the very first tip, I call it squeeze the lemon. When I want to make lemonade, I take a lemon, I cut it, I squeeze it, I get lemon juice, I make lemonade, life's good. But if I squeeze the lemon harder, I can get more out of it. So the first tip is, I think a lot of times when people come to this world of facilitation, they probably already know enough stuff. They know enough activities, they have enough resources, but maybe they haven't figured out how to get the most out of those activities. So the idea behind Squeeze the Lemon was to take the things you already know how to do and improve them. And let me give you a quick example, because out of that first tip is a future book waiting to be told of how people tweaked something and made it even better. An example I give in the first part of that book that I'm working on comes from my friend Guido, who lives in northern Italy. And Guido takes his family to Greece every summer for a vacation. In August, a lot of Europeans take, almost the entire month off and do vacations. So Guido and his family are in Greece. It's a beautiful place. And a neighbor comes by and says, "Do your children like to ride horses?" And Guido's like, "Yeah, they love that." So they bring the horses over, and the four of them, they go off for a trail ride. But it's Greece and it's August and it's hot. So in the afternoon, the horses are just kind of tethered down by the beach and the kids are in the water playing. And the neighbor comes back and says, "Why aren't the kids on the horses?" And he said, "Oh, it just got too hot." And he said, "Didn't I tell you?" And Guido's like, "What?" He says, "The horses like to go in the sea too. You can ride the horses in the sea." So the next picture, and it'll be in the book, shows Guido's son. And I can't explain it. It's almost a Mr. Ed kind of thing. This horse has a big smile on its face because it's out in the cool water riding in the sea. So riding horses in Greece, cool thing to do. Riding horses in the sea, in the Mediterranean in Greece, is a very cool thing to do. And that was the idea. It was the same similar activity, but by tweaking it, you really put it over the top. You have an activity that you really want to use with groups because it's going to do great things for them and create great teachable moments. So Squeeze a Lemon kind of became the first theme, if you will, of this tips and tools section. And then there's a few more that just kind of lend themselves to my facilitation world. When I do icebreakers, I have what I call the law of 7 minutes. I never do a single icebreaker for more than 7 minutes. If I had 20 minutes for icebreakers, I would rather do 3 different things than a single activity for the duration. And it keeps the energy high. So little themes like that are just things that I've discovered in the world that I think make my facilitation more engaging, more memorable for the audiences, maybe a little less threatening to people who don't necessarily want to be, at the event. For those employees whose boss said, you need team building, you need to go to this workshop, and they show up as kind of a prisoner, I want to help them see the value in the kind of things we do. So that first chapter has 100 of these kind of tips in it. Let me do another one that comes out of some experience. I often get a chance to travel internationally, and when I'm in a foreign country where English is not the primary language, there's usually a translator that helps me. The more words I use to introduce an activity, the more words they have to translate. So it's challenging, I think, when you're working with groups in foreign countries. The challenge is to minimize the amount of time it takes you to introduce an activity. So I've gotten very succinct in terms of how I present something. And that lends itself to a lot, because most of the activities that I introduce, I can explain to the group in less than a minute. My conviction is that if you spend more than 5 minutes introducing an activity, you've lost people. So by keeping it concise. So these are just 3 quick examples of kind of the lessons learned in working with groups over the years. And there's lots more in the book as well.
Since you brought it up, I'm curious, have you seen patterns in how many of the participants are apprehensive or, don't want to be there, especially when you're working with adults? I've estimated in my career that, pre-pandemic, that about a third of the people were really excited about being there, a third of the people were neutral, and a third of the people have had some negative experience with the concept of team building and were just like, ugh, this is a waste of time, or I don't want to be embarrassed, or those kind of things. Do you have any thoughts on that idea?
I think several. Mark and I recently attended the AEE conference in North Carolina, and we were doing I was doing a large session with a group, probably had 250 people in a fairly large room. But I could see people in that space here in the post-pandemic world who were working themselves towards the outside because they just wanted to have a little greater amount of space around them. Other people were right in the center of the fray, happy to be there. The bar is pretty low here in the post-pandemic world. People are just so happy to be together again. But some people still have a comfort zone that goes beyond introvert, extrovert. It goes into kind of the things that they went through during the pandemic. So some of the mental health issues, related to reintroducing people to being part of a group when they've been separated, isolated, socially distanced. It's a new challenge. The good news is facilitators as a whole, I believe, are really capable people. And the best example I can give you is how many people pivoted to the virtual at the start of the pandemic. I mean, that was a big learning curve for a lot of people to go from real world in-person things to a more virtual presentation. And like most things, some people did extraordinarily well at that. Some people were, practitioners. Some people were happy when things started to open up again and return to real world in-person events. But I think that's the skill of a facilitator, is to use whatever techniques you can to serve the audiences that need your help.
I'm tempted to go down the virtual facilitation rabbit trail again, but we can chat about that another time.
Well, here's the good news.
Yeah.
In many ways, the virtual capabilities of groups, and some people, really did well in the virtual world, and it met the needs of a group of people. I had clients who said, we can't get together, so what else can we do? And it filled kind of a vital gap in that. But I think that the best lesson for me in the last couple of years as a facilitator was that ability to pivot and to try new things, and to and not only to try them, but to maybe get better at those kind of things too. I think as we go forward, there's going to be new opportunities. God bless the people at Zoom for creating software before there was a definitive need for it. I mean, people enjoyed it, but it just might be a different opportunity. And I think you're right. You could do entire episodes on this in the future. And we're going to continue to get better at those things. But I can tell you personally, as someone who doesn't have great computer bandwidth, I'm kind of happy to be back in the real world, in-person world again.
Yeah, when folks ask me, does WorkPlay do virtual events? I'm like, well, we can. It is not my preference. I have a strong default to being in person, but there's folks that are just thriving in the virtual space. It's fun to see that. So
I
I
should
think,
share with
yeah.
you, last summer in June, I had a kind of a glamour gig with Microsoft out in Seattle, and I had a chance to see their campus for the first time. And a fellow came from Birmingham, England, flew to Montreal and then Vancouver and then Seattle to be at this event, flew about 30 hours so he could be present with the members of his team. And when I was chatting with him, he said, yeah, we're tired of the virtual stuff. And I said, wait a minute, you're Microsoft. You guys invented this stuff. And he says, I want to be with my people in the same space. And today's really important to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the fact that it exists as a capability will always endure. But I also think you need to listen to your clients. And sometimes when they're ready, doing some real world in-person stuff, I think has value, as does virtual.
Yeah, I have this theory or working idea, and I don't know if it's true, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Is that what facilitators do, what experiential learning professionals do, is often provide the environment or the venue that's missing or novel from the day-to-day workplace. So that's why folks do a backpacking trip or a rock climbing trip, because they're not doing that kind of thing every day. That's why folks love ropes courses and zip lines, because it's new, it's novel, it's different from what they are doing on a day-to-day basis. So if your 9 to 5 job is sitting in front of a computer all day, every day, then the thing that group of people needs more is in-person interaction with other human beings, and vice versa. I've been playing with that idea of saying
Sure.
like, hey, what we really need to be giving is the thing that they're missing, as far as the venue, as far as the novelty. And maybe that's just how I'm wired, but I think there's probably some truth there.
I think there's some value there. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
let me just share just a couple of quick things that are in the book that are kind of interesting, that in addition to those 100 tips, which I think are going to be outstanding, I put my favorite activities of all times in there. I listed models that I thought facilitators should know in general. And I also did, in my first book, Teamwork and Team Play, I had a really extensive bibliography. This time I went for quality, not necessarily quantity. I listed the books that were influential to me. So if you want a Christmas list, I would say look at that chapter, because chapter 4 has books that I think help me become better at what I do. I also did a chapter called A Wider View of the Facilitation World, where I talk about all the other occupations or professions you can have without necessarily being the facilitator in front of a group. Michelle Cummings is a good example, very capable facilitator, but she also runs an organization that's a store that provides resources for people. Some people manufacture equipment. And so there's lots of different things you can do. There's also a chapter I like called The Metamorphosis of a World-Class Activity. And I looked at some activities and their historical development over the years. And that was really fun to look backwards and see how these things became even better. I have a friend that does a workshop called Games So Old They're New Again. There are team building games we learned back in the new games days and the early days of the profession that are having new life again. And I think my favorite one is, in my basement, I've got 3 or 4 Rubbermaid containers full of stuff that's not an activity yet, but it could be. It's a list of potentials. And sometimes people, when they come visit, they just want to see that pile of stuff I have. So I wrote this chapter called Cogitation, Incubation, and the Art of Sustained Thinking. I have 2 things here in my office on my desk that I pick up every day that are not an activity yet, but they could be. And I keep twiddling with them and kind of manipulating them until I can get them into something that I think will be valuable for a group to play with. And that's really kind of fun. So those are additional things. And like I said, I want people to pick this up because I want to be better at facilitation, but I also want them to see the value of the width of our profession and some of the amazing things we can do. So there's just a kind of a quick synopsis of the cool things that are inside the book. But I think it's the kind of thing that if you say, I want to be better at my profession, this is a resource I think is going to help people. And it's about the same size and thickness as Teamwork and Team Play. So you're going to get the full course meal with this one.
Love it. I am eager to read the chapter on that kind of idea lab creation thing, because that is obviously one of my passions. We went to this open space event that I helped start several years back called the Georgia Facilitator Summit. And Dale Robinson and I led a workshop on, what was it called? What else can you do with your stuff? And literally, we just went into the equipment shed of the host site and just started pulling things out and saying, all right, these are our resources. Let's make something new, or let's do a traditional activity with different materials. And it was so much fun. It was so much fun.
I'll bet. I like seeing other people's collections of stuff. It's like, well, what do you do with this? Or what's this for?
So we are coming up on, I won't say how much time in case I cut anything out, but we're going to put part 1 on pause. So we have been chatting with Dr. Jim Cain, author of Extraordinary Facilitation and 27 other books about team building and groups and leading activities. We thank Jim for his wonderful contributions to the world of adventure and experiential education. And we will pick up our conversation with Dr. Jim Cain in part 2. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review, tell a friend, give us a gold star, or call my grandma. And if you want unforgettable events and training that's fun, like for real fun, get started today at WorkPlaySolutions.com. I know I want that. Boo, boo, boo.
I think your mic's off.
Yes, you're right.